Okay, so if you've watched my last video, what you will already know is that I've done a data collection of over 2,000 different roles in the world of cloud, and I presented in the last video a bunch of generic insights that I found out from that data collection about the different skills that are required from different employers for the different roles. Now, if you've followed me for any amount of time, you'll know that I'm constantly recommending that rather than looking at the overall coverage of skills across the entire industry, is that you focus on specific roles. I went away and did some specific analysis of the differences between the overall skills for the cloud industry versus how those skills match up for the individual specific role. So what I'm going to do is actually break down 6 different roles in the cloud industry and talk about how those skills for those specific roles differ to the overall skills required for the entirety of the cloud industry. I'll talk to you briefly about what the role actually is, and then we'll have a look at the actual skills related to that specific role and how they differ to that main cloud skill set. And that should actually give us a better picture and understanding of what that role actually does and where you should spend your time when it comes to building your own learning plan for getting into the cloud industry. Okay, so the first role that I want to discuss with you is the data engineer. Now, data engineer is quite a technical engineering role on the data side. So what that data engineer is usually responsible for is moving data about between different places, manipulating that data, and often that is with a kind of a software engineer type of mindset. Now, in terms of the differences between the skill sets, interestingly, the 2 skills that go up most for the data engineer compared to cloud are both Python and SQL. Now, SQL jumps from 20% for the entirety of the industry up to over 70% needing SQL or mentioned in these job descriptions. Python also goes up from 40% to again above 70% across all of these different roles. Now, what that tells you is just the emphasis on these 2 areas, and these skills then go from sort of a nice to have into a you really need to have that if you're looking to get into a data role. Now, you can see as well from the drastic increase in the number of jobs that are requiring SQL is just the emphasis on databases and data storage that is needed for the data engineering role. Now, across cloud, SQL is down at 20%, which means that really it is more of a nice to have for a lot of the other roles, but for the data engineer specifically, knowing databases and data formats is going to be essential. Now, in terms of the skills that actually go down are the more dev or DevOps related skills. So Terraform, Kubernetes, Docker, all of those things go down in the percentages here when applied to the data engineer. So less emphasis on container technology and deploying applications, and more of a focus is on specific types of programming languages oriented to the data role and databases themselves. Okay, next up is the DevOps Engineer. So the DevOps Engineer is a much misunderstood role. Generally, the interpretation of what a DevOps Engineer does in the industry is they are working on automation, on making developers more productive by bringing their code and deploying it into production faster. So that typically means more of a focus on what is known as an automation pipeline, or you might hear it as CI/CD, which stands for continuous integration and continuous deployment. Now, DevOps engineers typically work alongside developers to try and streamline some of these aspects, this automation, so that the development process itself becomes easier. Now, in terms of skill sets, the things that go up for the DevOps engineer is CI/CD and also Terraform. Now, neither of those are massively surprising to me because both CI/CD and Terraform are focused on automation and scripting things and that type of stuff. So CI/CD is about, as we mentioned before, moving code into production in a quick and automated fashion, and Terraform is about moving some of your infrastructure definitions into code and automating that entire process. Okay, next up is the platform engineer. Now, I get a lot of questions of people asking, what is the difference between DevOps engineer, cloud engineer, and platform engineer? Now, a platform engineer typically focuses on building out what is known as a central platform. They are building central self-service types of components that the rest of the people in the organization will use. Now, this differs a little bit from a DevOps engineer who might typically be working in or with one of the teams in a more hands-on way, whereas a platform engineer is typically building aspects of this platform that are centrally managed, and developers can use that, but it's less hands-on. They're not directly working with those teams themselves. Now, in terms of skills that we see for the platform engineer changing, one of the biggest movers is actually Kubernetes, which jumps from about 50% for the overall data set up to 77%, nearly 80% for Kubernetes itself. Now again, that is a little bit unsurprising because if you have any understanding of what Kubernetes is that you know it is a tool for building platforms. Kubernetes itself is a container orchestration platform, and it is quite complicated, which means that you typically have sort of administration people or these platform engineers that govern the actual deployment of the central Kubernetes infrastructure itself. Then you'll have development teams or developers that deploy onto Kubernetes but maybe don't have a full understanding of exactly how all of the different aspects work. So that's typically what a platform engineer does. Now in terms of skill set, it doesn't necessarily differ too much from a DevOps or a cloud engineer. It is more about the organizational context in which a platform engineer works. And then also for the platform engineer, what we see is some of the other skills, kind of like GitHub Actions and Docker and things like that, also increasing a little bit as well. Okay, so now let's talk about the site reliability engineer. Site reliability engineers are typically focused on ensuring the uptime of an application. So they often have kind of like a software engineer type background, but are focused more on ensuring uptime through tools like monitoring, improving deployment processes, and things like that. Now, what was interesting about the dataset here for the site reliability engineer is there was a big increase in Grafana. So Grafana itself is a monitoring tool. I wouldn't necessarily say that Grafana is one of the most widely used tools necessarily. There are lots of other similar or complementary tools, but it's interesting to see how monitoring jumps up by, I think, about 25% for the site reliability engineer, as more of an emphasis is put on monitoring tools as opposed to other areas. Now, what I found kind of interesting also about the site reliability engineer skill set in general was also more of this focus on what I would call fundamentals. So focusing more on Docker, on networking, and on Linux. Now, the reason for that, in my opinion, is also because in order to do site reliability engineering in a good way, you actually have to have a good, strong understanding of the architecture of the systems underneath the platforms that you're deploying. Think about it. If you want to improve the reliability of a system, that is very difficult if you don't understand how that application is developed and how it's deployed and the underlying architecture. And like I say, site reliability engineers often have a very similar skill set to a software engineer, or might have come from a software engineer background. However, they are emphasizing more on sort of monitoring and those types of tools as well. Okay, so moving on to the support engineer. Now this is really just your support type role, someone who is a slightly less technical individual, and this is probably one of the roles that shifted the most apart from data engineer, with lots of different changes compared to the overall skill set. Now what we see drop for the support engineer is a lot of the dev focused tools, so Docker and Python and programming language, CI/CD, all of these fall in emphasis for the support engineer. And interestingly, what the skills that go up are actually more of Microsoft type skills. So we see SQL Server, we see Active Directory, and Azure itself all go up in the number of job descriptions that are requesting those skills. Now, what that tells me is if you're looking to try and get into the cloud industry via a support role, you might want to put more of an emphasis on the Microsoft ecosystem. Now, that again doesn't surprise me because the different cloud platforms like AWS and GCP are often more focused on the developer themselves and are very technical in nature, whereas Microsoft itself, the Microsoft suite, and a lot of the tools in the Microsoft ecosystem focus on more sort of generic business tools and typically will lend itself to slightly more non-technical people like support. And I think that's why you see sort of this Microsoft emphasis in the support role itself. So that's very interesting to me. If you're looking at which cloud provider to pick up and learn and you're thinking about going via this support route, then maybe think about putting more of an emphasis on Microsoft rather than on, let's say, the Amazon or the Google ecosystem.
Developers, 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 developers.
Okay, and then last up is the backend engineer. Typically a backend engineer works on software engineering that is sort of behind the scenes. So the contrast to a back engineer is usually a front-end engineer who works mostly on sort of UI and UI development. That is the interfaces that actually you see, the websites, applications, apps that you interact as an individual. Whereas the back-end engineer works very much in the back office. That might be processing payments, creating accounts, things that you don't necessarily see so much as a user and typically doesn't have a user interface associated with it. Now, in terms of skills for the backend engineer that change, what we see is less of an emphasis on Terraform and on infrastructure as code. Now, That is probably because companies are often choosing to have someone like a DevOps engineer who focuses more on that. We saw before how Terraform went up for some of the roles like DevOps, Cloud and Platform Engineer. However, for Backend Engineer, less of an emphasis is required on infrastructure as code itself. For the Backend Engineer, what we actually see is more of an emphasis on databases and APIs. That again is unsurprising because the primary creator of APIs within a company is going to be developers themselves. So we see a focus on REST and GraphQL, which are both tools in order to create APIs themselves, and a focus on databases like Postgres and MySQL. Now, just like the data engineer, software engineers are also going to be interfacing with the databases more often probably than the other roles themselves, so there is more of an emphasis on that as well. So if you're looking to get into the cloud industry by the backend engineer role, what you can do is you can focus a little bit more on APIs and databases and maybe a little bit less on sort of automation, infrastructure as code and those types of tools. Now, that doesn't mean to say that a backend engineer doesn't touch the cloud. This really depends on the type of company that you're working in. Like we mentioned about platform engineer, the company might have a central platform that automates away a lot of the cloud infrastructure from the engineer, or sometimes in some companies they like to have their backend engineers exposed to a lot of cloud services. It really depends on the type of company. Okay, so that was a quick run through of these different types of roles. Hopefully now you have a bit of a better understanding about what these roles actually do, and hopefully by getting this data you're also starting to see what I was talking about at the start, which is why you should focus on specific areas or specific skills for certain roles when it comes to getting into the cloud industry. Now, I'll publish this data as well so that you can access it in the description, and I'm also working on trying to find a good way to host this information so that you can access it easily as well. But I hope this video helped in order to decipher those. I'll do some deeper dives in future on these specific roles themselves and how they work individually, but I hope by putting them side by side like this and looking at the skills, you're starting to see how those roles differ and potentially how they fit into the broader picture of the cloud industry as a whole. So thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video.